Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. And my name is Tom Switzer. I'm the Executive Director at CIS. We're gathered here this evening to celebrate the publication of a book by my friend and fellow CIS board member, James Phillips. Now, to say that Australians are besotted by American affairs would clearly be an understatement. The former Labor leader, Federal Labor leader and the ambassador to the United States, now Governor of Western Australia, Kim Beazley, is often fond of saying that more Australians are highly engaged with US politics than even Americans. In 2016, this was the Trump-Clinton election campaign, it was reported by the Sydney Morning Herald's Peter Harcher, past guest at CIS, that Australian television and radio gave the US election campaign double the coverage they gave our own federal election campaign a few months earlier. Extraordinary, in 2016. But the question today is, do Australians know much about the US Constitution and indeed the US Revolution, which serves as the central legitimating idea behind nationhood? After all, the United States is the world's oldest constitutional republic. And yet today, America, as we all know, is deeply divided and frighteningly polarised. James Phillips is author of Two Revolutions and the Constitution, How the English and American Revolutions Produced the American Constitution. It's published, and the Revolution, it's published by Hamilton Books. James is also a lawyer and a visiting lecturer at the University of Sydney's Law School. And as I said earlier, James is a board member and has been a board member at CIS for 10 to 15 years. And with that, please welcome James.
Excellent. Good evening. We've had a plague and now this evening floods to try to prevent this event from occurring. I don't quite know why. I'm not sure it'll be that contentious, but we'll see what you think. Before I begin my remarks, I'd like to thank the Centre for Independent Studies for inviting me to participate in this event, because although I am a non-executive director here, that doesn't carry the right to be invited to be a speaker here. So I personally regard it as an honour to be here. And as you know, the CIS is one of Australia's leading public policy research institutes, and it produces outstanding evidence-based public policy recommendations, including to improve literacy amongst disadvantaged children, to improve conditions in remote Indigenous communities, and to reduce intergenerational inequality. Now, a week ago, I Googled the phrase Trump coup. I got almost 4 million results. Overwhelmingly, the results which I reviewed, I didn't review all of them, argued that the January 6th riot at the Capitol and Trump's attacks on the presidential election result were an attempted coup to illegally retain the presidency. In Australia, there have been two recent prime ministers who are almost as narcissistic as Trump. Neither responded well when members of his party dumped him as Prime Minister. In the years since they were dumped, each of the former Prime Ministers has taken every opportunity to undermine his successors. So in Australia, we know that the wounded narcissist is an ugly beast. Let's assume that President Trump was so narcissistic and so indifferent to the Constitution that he believed that his desire to win trumped the Constitution. Let's assume that he would have been happy to use illegal means to retain the presidency. Could he have succeeded? Well, no. There are three main reasons for that, and each of them is grounded in the American Constitution. The first is that the Constitution sets out a legal framework within which the president must operate and a legal framework for the conduct of elections. It gives the Senate jurisdiction to impeach the president and the Supreme Court the power to determine the scope of the president's powers. The second is that the Constitution established a structure of government which makes it very hard for any one branch of government to ignore the Constitution. The Constitution sets up a system of constant friction and rivalry between the President, Congress and the courts, the famous checks and balances. The third is that behavioural norms and institutional norms have developed in America to respect the Constitution. Most Americans know that in their vast and diverse republic, ignoring the Constitution and the system of government that it creates would be likely to have calamitous consequences for the republic. Trump was never likely to subvert enough people in all the organs of law, government, the military and the media that he would have needed to mount a successful coup. These three anti-coup aspects of this system established by the Constitution would all have had to fail for Trump to succeed in a coup. The Constitution matters a lot. The January 6 riot at the Capitol was not part of a coup attempt. The rabble who invaded the Capitol were not the shock troops of an organised seizure of power. None of them has been charged with treason or sedition. That is not because the prosecutors are Trumpists working to downgrade the charges. It is because the rioters' actions simply were not, on the evidence, part of a plan to seize power. Personally, I found all the noise about the Trump attempted coup rather odd. Didn't the protagonists of those stories know that the framers of the Constitution were obsessed with the need to avoid tyranny and to protect the political rights and freedoms of free Americans? Didn't they know that the Constitution deliberately creates friction between different organs of government and different economic and other interests in the nation in an attempt to make tyranny by one person or one faction impossible in the United States? Didn't they know the history of the origins of the American Constitution? Trump engaged in abhorrent conduct, but that conduct was never going to deliver him a second term in 2020, and it will probably only harm his prospects of winning another term in 2024. The Constitution matters a lot, and how it came about matters. In my view, it's impossible to understand a structure and system of government just by reading a description of the system. You need to also understand the context in which the system was conceived. Context breathes purpose and meaning into the words of the Constitution. America was founded on the Constitution. The United States of America was a term used in the 11 years before the Constitution, but the new nation was not legally established until the Constitution was adopted. The Constitution determines the structure of government in America and the ground rules for how the Federation works. As Tom's mentioned, my book's title is Two Revolutions and the Constitution, How the English and American Revolutions Produced the American Constitution. The book is concise, about 60,000 words. It tells how the American Revolutionary period and the Constitutional Convention at Philadelphia in 1787 determined the structure of the system of government set out in the Constitution and the language of the document. But many books on the origins of the Constitution deal with that period. My book also answers the question, British American colonists rebelled to protect their political rights. Where did those political rights come from? It tells the story of not only how the Constitution was conceived and drafted in the revolutionary period, but also where the political values that it enshrines come from. And this second aspect, the origins of the political values of the founders and framers, is not normally told as part of the story of the origins of the Constitution. But in my opinion, it's vital. Reflect for a moment on the contents of the Declaration of Independence. The actual declaration that the British colonies of America now considered themselves to be independent and no longer subject to British government is a very small part of the document. Most of the declaration is a series of charges against George III for infringing the alleged political rights and liberties of free colonial Americans. Where did those rights and liberties come from is a question prompted by the Declaration itself. To understand the American Constitution, we need to understand how colonial Americans came to believe that their rights and liberties existed. Now let me mention a few facts which might help to illustrate the importance of the history before the American Revolutionary period. I said before that the framers of the Constitution were obsessed with the need to avoid tyranny. Why was that? Well, they knew from their general knowledge of history that tyranny is the normal form of government. They knew that Athenian democracy and then the Roman Republic had not lasted. They knew from recent English and colonial history that twice in the 1600s the English had rebelled against their king because the king had sought to rule in breach of conventions about Parliament's role. In 1649, the English Rump Parliament had charged Charles I with tyranny, tried him and executed him, and established an English republic. In 1776, the founders charged George III with tyranny, rebelled, seceded, and established a republic. After 12 years, the English Republic had collapsed, and English King Charles II was crowned. Charles II and his successor James II established more colonies in America, but they also sought to increase English control of the colonies. The English, with Dutch help, expelled James II and, in the English Revolution, established a new English constitution under which Parliament and the English people had many powers and rights which superseded the king's. In America, during the English Revolution, there were major rebellions against James II in New England, New York, and Maryland. In the American Revolution in the 1760s and 1770s, for the second time, the British tried to increase their control over their colonies in America. For the second time, Americans rebelled against Britain. Now, another fact which helps to illustrate the importance of history before the American Revolutionary period is this. Before independence, there was no document called the American Constitution, of course. In America, there were only colonies. Yet, in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson referred to our Constitution, meaning the colonial Americans' Constitution. What did he mean? One of Jefferson's charges against the British King George III was that the British had tried to impose laws on the colonies which were, quote, foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws. When Jefferson wrote our Constitution, he was referring to the system of government in Britain's 13 American colonies that had rebelled against the king. Most of that system was not recorded in writing. It was found in the unwritten British Constitution and in the unwritten conventions about the partial self-government of the colonies. The most famous convention was that the British could not impose direct taxes on Americans. The American argument was that it was an ancient principle of the British Constitution that direct taxes could only be imposed with the approval of the elected chamber of the British Parliament, the House of Commons. Since Americans had no elected representatives in the House of Commons, only Americans' colonial elected bodies could impose direct taxes on Americans. There could be no taxation without representation. Jefferson's claim was, in effect, that Americans' rights to partial self-government were part of their Constitution, and those rights could not be revoked by the British. And because the King and Parliament had breached the Americans' unwritten Constitution, the Declaration said that Americans were able to leave the British Empire and establish 13 new states as successors to 13 British colonies. The question of whether there were American constitutional rights before the American Rebellion is not a dry or technical legal question. It was at the heart of the American Revolution. Free Americans did not rebel against Britain to remake the world in the way that Russians and Chinese were to do subsequently. They rebelled to protect their rights and enhance their independence. After the War of Independence had been won, it was necessary to secure the gains of the revolution. How would that be done? With a new constitution, the written American Constitution, which was drafted in Philadelphia 11 years after the Declaration of Independence. And my book has been described as debunking American exceptionalism because it shows that while there were great American innovations in the revolutionary period, especially at Philadelphia, the political values which the Constitution was built on had their foundations in the founding of the colonies and the revolutionary English century, the 1600s. I didn't set out to criticise the exceptionalist narrative of the conception of the Constitution, just to tell the truth as I saw it. But when people say that by placing the Constitution in a deeper context, the book strikes a blow against the exceptionalist narrative, I'm not unhappy. It is possible that one of the reasons that progressive historical narratives have recently become so vociferous and selective, focusing in particular on allegations about the institution of slavery, is that the previously dominant exceptionalist narrative was also highly selective. To place the conception of the Constitution in a deeper context is not to diminish the achievements of the framers. Indeed, one reviewer has said that my book is too uncritical of the framers. My book celebrates the framers' solution in 1787, which was, as a matter of political science and political systems, more revolutionary than any of the English innovations of the earlier period, including the short-lived English Republic. The framers' solution articulated in a single document a new system of government built on the new principle of the sovereignty of people divided between the state and national governments. It was an immense and epochal achievement which changed the world. I hope I've given you some idea of the purpose and scope of my book. To wrap up, I cannot do better than to quote John Ferling, the American professor of history and author of 15 books on the American Revolutionary period, who has written of my book, "Two Revolutions and the Constitution demonstrates that the American constitutional system, federalism, checks and balances, etc., drew on the colonists' understanding of British laws and government, although the final product grew from what the founders felt they had learnt about effective governance in the course of the American Revolution and the desperate War of Independence. This important book teaches about the building blocks of history. It demonstrates how ideas spring from experience and events, and from what political actors concluded were earlier mistakes, in this instance the presumed flaws in the first state and national constitutions." Thank you all for your interest in this topic, and I hope you find my book helpful.
Yeah, James. Well, James, thank you very much. And now I'd like to call on our panel, Louise, Clegg and Stephen Loosley. Now, Louise is a barrister. She's practiced widely in public law and teaches undergraduate and postgraduate public law subjects. And as it happens, she's actually reviewed James's book in the current issue of The Spectator Australia. Please welcome Louise. And Stephen Loosley is a senior fellow at the University of Sydney's United States Studies Centre. He's a former ALP senator, president of the ALP. He's also deputy chair of the defence contractor Thales Australia. Please welcome Stephen.
Thank you.
And I should stress that both Louise and Stephen are past guests at CIS, so it's great to have you both back here. Let me just ask a few questions to James about his thesis, just generally. You make it obviously very clear that the American Constitution establishes a system of government to empower free individuals, and of course CIS champions free individuals. Just take us back to this period in the 1770s and 1780s. How on earth did this happen at a time when so many rulers around the world, in fact all the rulers around the world, were either monarchs, emperors or chiefs who had absolute power?
Well, There's an English part to that answer and an American part to that answer. And I don't say that because of the title of my book directly. But there was already in England, when people were leaving there and going to the American colonies, and at the relevant time, most, but by no means all, of the colonists had come from Britain. There was a rising class of merchants, manufacturers, financiers, who were gaining more political power. That's what the two English revolutions of the 1600s were largely about. So accompanying that was, of course, the beginning of the Enlightenment that encouraged the use of reason rather than other allegiances and methods as a foundational principle for conducting human activities, including political activities. Okay, so that's part of the British side. Let's look at the American side to answer that question. One of the interesting things, and of course one of the points of great contrast with Australia, is that the 13 colonies were established as private enterprises. The Crown, when the colonies were established, did not have the resources to establish colonies on the other side of the Atlantic. So people were out there in what was generally called the wilderness. In some places it had actually been depopulated by diseases, etc., which had swept through before the colonists arrived. In other cases, of course, there were transactions or conflict with Native Americans. But in any event, small populations out there in the wilderness trying desperately to create viable societies. Not an easy thing to do. And as you probably know, several of the colonies, soon after they were established, nearly starved to death and faced massive problems. So I think the combination of this change in economic structures, changes in technologies, changes in philosophy, and then particularly the circumstances of trying to establish new societies in America helped to produce this more individualistic culture and focus on individual rights.
Your answer then, does that mean you'd agree with Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States in the 1980s? In 1981, he said that the American Revolution of 1776 was, quote, the only true philosophical revolution in human history. And he says, quote, oh, there have been revolutions before and since ours, but those revolutions simply exchanged one set of rules for another. Ours was a revolution that changed the very concept of government. That's Ronald Reagan in 1981, James Phillips.
Well, did I mention American exceptionalism before? So this is preposterous, really.
Reagan's point here is preposterous.
Yes, it's preposterous. So it's a major achievement of political science to take the rules of what was an emerging, what we would call liberal society and liberal republic, let's say, to adapt them to a republican model and to a federal model. So from a political science point of view, there's a great achievement. But are we really to believe that there was greater continuity between Russia before the Russian Revolution and Russia after the Russian Revolution than there was in America, where the system of property rights, economic system, and much else, political rights continued as they were before? They were just recast in this new American model. Are we really to believe that there was more continuity in China at the time of the Communist Revolution than there was in America? I think it's a profoundly ahistorical statement.
This is the Founding Fathers, the American Founding Fathers' motto of the New Republic in Latin, Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is New Order for the Ages. And Reagan was often fond of quoting Thomas Paine, quote, we have the power to begin the world over again. That sounds like a truly philosophical revolution, doesn't it?
Well, it is a revolution of the sort that I mentioned. It's a recasting of and if you like, a turbocharging of the values that were emerging. It actually emerged first, actually, in some ways in the Netherlands, and then in particular in Britain and in colonial America. So I'd say, as I said, it is a revolution of political science, and it was a great revolution, of course, because it's survived.
Yes.
And it's been good for America and the world. I would say not catastrophic as some other revolutions have been.
Forgive me for being sensitive about the year 1776, and my predecessor and our founder, Greg Lindsay, is at the back there, but 1776 is a very special year for liberty because it's the year of the American Revolution, primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson. It's also the year of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and then 200 years later, CIS was created, and Milton Friedman, our intellectual hero, won the Nobel Prize for Economics. And in 1976, Friedrich Hayek, I think, made his first and only trip, the great Austrian economist, to Australia. So 1776 has a special resonance for us. But, of course, one of the big points about the Constitution is the checks and balances in the system. You've dealt with this in your book. The United States government, of course, has not just the executive branch, which is the administration, but the legislative branch and the judicial branch. Has that worked, or has that undermined efforts to reform things?
Both. But it was intended to undermine efforts to reform things because it was intended to avoid the dominance of one political, economic, social faction over others. So it was intended that there would be friction in the system. So the price of that is if you believe that substantial reform is required, it's difficult. The virtue of it is that it enables a very, very diverse and an enormous diverse country to continue and for the Constitution to survive.
Checks and balances, keeping in, making sure that tyranny does not arise. Stephen, James mentioned Donald Trump and the January 6th coup. Some Americans said that they were afraid that President Trump would become a tyrant or a fascist, or that he would not leave office after an election lost. How realistic were those fears?
If you look at some of the evidence before the Congressional Committee on January 6 and some of the commentary about what was happening at the Willard Hotel in those days, I think some of those fears were well grounded. Donald Trump certainly endeavoured to move heaven and earth to retain office. His own staff were telling him that he was being fed nonsense by the likes of Rudy Giuliani, yet he persisted with people like Giuliani and Sidney Powell, and of course in the insurrection at the Capitol, while Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, was a focus of considerable hostility, so was Vice President Mike Pence, and there's no question that there was pressure on the then Vice President to discard some of the results from some of the states. And it's to the credit of the Vice President and people whom he consulted, such as former Vice President Dan Quayle, to reaffirm his role as ceremonial. You mentioned Tom Paine earlier, and I just want to go back to something that James said, the importance of philosophy in the American Revolution. In the early days of the war, as people are aware, Washington's army, the Continentals, suffered a number of reversals, being driven out of New York City, defeated at White Plains, and retreating to a place in New Jersey called Valley Forge, where they spent a truly horrific winter. But a turning point comes in the battles of Princeton and Trenton. And for those of you who have enjoyed Emanuel Leutz's painting in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., Washington crossing the Delaware, that really picks up the spirit of what happened. But the key thing, James, I think, is before the American army embarked on the river, Washington insisted that something be read to them. And what it was an essay that Tom Paine had published in Philadelphia just a few days before, which began with the extraordinary phrase, "These are the times which try men's souls." Now, the army was ragged, a lot of them didn't have boots, they were underfed, but this was truly inspiring.
Yeah.
Truly inspiring.
Yeah. And it gets back to this point about the threats to institutions. Louise, in your review for the Spectator magazine of James's book, you talk about the threats to institutions and norms that hold them together. What do you mean by norms, and can you give us an example?
Yes, so we do talk a lot. I think both the left and the right, because we're also polarised these days, talk a lot about threats to democracy and threats to institution and give their own examples. I mean, the institutions are really the parliament, the courts, the significant sort of holders of power, repositories of power, and even I even consider things like the rule of law and the things that support the rule of law, freedom of speech, the presumption of innocence, things like that, I consider almost institutional norms. But I see a lot of what is going on at the moment as the norms of conduct around those institutions, which are the underlying threat. So cultural differences and disputes which impact and undermine those institutions. So there's a couple of quite controversial, very contemporary examples I could use. I mean, one is the what I consider to be the trial by media of Christian Porter. Yep. We have never done that before in Australian political history. Not quite like that. People say, oh, well, the media went after George Pell too. But Pell, at least, there was a trial and there was a conviction, and then that was appealed and the High Court quashed that conviction. So ultimately, Pell was tried by the institution. In Porter's case, he has been tried by the media. When the institutions, and in this case the New South Wales police, decided that nothing could be done with the complaint, the national broadcaster decided to pursue him anyway. And that is quite a new thing, or it's not an entirely new thing, but it hasn't been done, I think, on that kind of scale in the way that it happened. And I mean, I consider that to be very problematic for our society because as a civil society, as a society based on norms that justify those institutions or that support those institutions, there is no way of dealing with the Porter case. No criminal trial could be conducted because there's no complainant, and nor could there be a civil inquiry, again because there's no complainant. You can't have a civil inquiry about a serious matter where there's still no complainant. So, I mean, a lot of senior lawyers suggested that, and I personally believe they should hang their heads in shame for contributing to this lack of respect and the breaking down of the norms. I'm probably going on too much about it, but that is a classic example of where people say it's undermining the institution, but it's really the norm that is being undermined, and that is that the idea that we don't conduct our political matters on trial by media.
Okay. So this is going beyond America. It's happening here in Australia, perhaps other Western liberal democracies. They're threatening to these norms. Stephen Loosley.
Yeah.
Well, for some in politics and the media, there is actually a reversal of the onus of proof. And the allegation has become the conviction. Mm-hmm. And people then work back from there. I think that's extremely dangerous. The circumstances that confronted people appearing before the House Un-American Activities Committee in the United States in the 40s and 50s were quite appalling, because the most dangerous question you could be asked was simply this: are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party of the United States of America? Now, if you said yes, then your career in whatever profession you're engaged was over. It's particularly true of Hollywood, of course. But if you answered no, you ran the risk of the committee producing a witness to contradict you, and you'd be charged with perjury. Now, it's like being hauled before a corruption commission. A lot of people automatically assume that you are corrupt. That's not the case, of course, if we value the presumption of innocence. So I think what Louise is saying is there are some extremely dangerous trends that erode our sense of liberty, which we've taken originally from Britain and built upon ourselves, built upon those foundations. And a part of that is the disappearance in some circumstances of the notion of the presumption of innocence, and the fact that people are entitled to a fair hearing. I think there are some trends in our society, as in the United States, which are very troubling.
Yeah, we saw a case, I think it was in 2018, when President Trump nominated Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. And there was an allegation that when he was at high school, he sexually harassed a lady, and she made the accusation that he harassed her, and this was a big issue in the confirmation hearings, but he was confirmed. And this gets back to the question of trust in institutions, James. We all too often see public opinion polling show declining levels of trust in institutions, not just in government, but in the judiciary, in media, even in the military, certainly in the United States. What do you make of this in light of America's 230-year-old constitution?
Well, I don't really know how to put that in context fully, but I mean, I can say it's very ugly, and I can make a couple of comments on it. I mean, on the one hand, to the extent that some people on the so-called progressive left in America have adopted sort of cultural Marxist philosophy that society should be divided into groups of oppressors and oppressed, and that it's important that the oppressors have always simply used power, notwithstanding all their tricks and pretense otherwise. It's always been an exercise just of raw power to oppress the oppressed, and the oppressed now need to do that to the oppressors. So people who think like that have an inherent disregard for institutions, because they're interested in this they just don't believe in them. They think they're a charade. They want to. And then you have people on the sort of more extreme right in America, I suppose, who believe that the whole system's rigged, completely dominated by liberals. It's stacked against them. They have insufficient influence, and so it's profoundly fractured. And behind that profound fracturing is very, very different views on a fairly fundamental level about the nature of what it is to be a person in society, a person in a political system, the extent to which people are inherently good or a mixture of good and evil. So I don't know what the future is for this fracturing, but it's obviously pretty profound at the moment.
Stephen Loosley.
You're eloquent, James, in your analysis. I'm actually much more confident about the resilience of the American Republic. Given its history, I am. Mm-hmm. How can anyone explain Senator Ted Cruz, Republican Texas, having an argument with Big Bird on Sesame Street? I mean, that is just demonstrating how far these cultural tensions have spread. So we are actually in the level of the bizarre and absurd.
Yeah. By the way, I didn't mean my comments to imply that I thought the Republic was in danger of collapsing. I think it will prove to be resilient, but I think there'll be difficult times ahead.
Let me put this to the panel. I mean, we all too often we indulge in the parochialism of the present. We think that what's happening now is quite unprecedented, and they are polarising times. But this is Robert Dallek, the distinguished American presidential historian. He says, political vitriol is a familiar enough characteristic of American history. Let's give a few examples here. The Federalists warned that presidential candidate Thomas Jefferson primarily wrote the Declaration of Independence because of his sympathy expressed at the outset of the French Revolution. They said he was a son of a half-breed Indian squaw who would put opponents under the guillotine. Jefferson supporters countered that opponent John Adams was, quote, a hideous, hermaphrodical character that is a half-man, half-woman. In the campaign-sanctioned broadsides and newspapers, John Quincy Adams was called a pimp. His opponent in 1828, Andrew Jackson, a bigamist, whose wife was a SLUT. Abraham Lincoln was called the original gorilla. William Jennings Bryan was dubbed a crazy degenerate and a wild-eyed radical who would redistribute wealth. Well, that's probably true. Later still, Franklin Roosevelt was called a demented paralytic cripple. Harry Truman, a fellow traveller, that is, a communist in other words. Barry Goldwater, the 1964 Republican presidential candidate, a dangerously psychotic warmonger. So, are we overstating the significance of this political polarisation today? Hasn't America always been a vibrant democracy, which sometimes means it's also polarising? Louise?
I think we are, yeah. I think we do overstate it. The reason it seems worse now than it has been in the past is because of the way we now consume information and the disaggregation of the media, the polarisation of the media, and so, not just social media but mainstream media. And so everyone's in their zone only thinking and reading what they like, and when they come across a viewpoint that is different, there's outrage. It feels worse than it is. That's why I have a fair bit of confidence in the resilience of the American Republic. And I think what we need to deal with fairly urgently in liberal democracies all around the world is deal with that in a way that is consistent with democratic values. And so we break up the social media companies, we make them publishers. That has to be done, in my view. That won't stop at all. I mean, we are getting more and more polarised. But look, I think those of us who think democracy is the best of a bunch of fairly ordinary options have to believe in America and the American Republic, because if democracy fails in America, I think it fails everywhere.
Well, Stephen, in the Australian newspaper recently, you wrote about past examples of decency in politics, and Nixon, Kennedy after the very contentious 1960 election campaign. You talk about the mid to late 40s and the early 50s when Robert Menzies, the then Prime Minister, and the opposition leader Ben Chifley would often have drinks in their offices together after tough parliamentary sessions. Have we lost that sense of decency in Canberra and Washington and Westminster?
I think it's proving elusive at the moment. Louise makes some valid points. I wanted to come back to one or two of your early quotes, Tom, which from memory were from the election of 1800.
Yep.
Which is the toughest election.
So Adams, Jefferson. Yep.
Yeah, and the element of communication at that time, of course, was the pamphlet. Newspapers were important, but pamphlets were more important. They were the social media outlets of the time. And the allegations were extraordinary, from murder to treason. And of course, in the background, Jefferson's running mate, Colonel Aaron Burr, was endeavouring to steal the election, ended up in the House, and how Jefferson is elected. So everything's got to be seen in terms of the evolution of the Republic. Why I think the US is more resilient than we realise, Tom, the very earliest days, just after the revolution has succeeded, there are rebellions against federal tax power. Whiskey Rebellion, the Shays Rebellion. Washington takes control of a state militia and puts them down. From the very earliest days, federal power is confirmed. In terms of the kind of civility that we have seen in times past, I think we need to recover a lot more of that. In the Senate, when Michael was there,
Michael Bohm, former Liberal
Senator Michael
yep.
Bohm, we'd have differences and so on and so forth, and there'd be arguments, and all I didn't agree with some of the things that Michael did. I'm sure he didn't agree with some of the things that I did. But you could have a conversation. And that was because no government had a working majority. So you had to be able to work with the opposition and with the minor parties and treat people with a certain courtesy. And that worked. Now, you have this circumstance at the moment with gotcha. Everyone's looking for the gotcha moment. It's true on both sides of the aisle. I think a certain bipartisanship really does work. The story about Nixon, would you like me to tell it?
1960 when he narrowly loses to Kennedy. Yep.
November 1960 at the time was the closest American presidential election in their history. And Jack Kennedy was holidaying in Florida. Nixon was holidaying in Florida. Ambassador Joe Kennedy, father of the president-elect, rang Herbert Hoover, President Hoover, and said he thought it would be a good idea, given the tension, and there was the threat that the Republicans would challenge results in Illinois and Texas. And the Republicans hadn't been blameless in the balloting either, but Illinois and Texas had been outstanding. Mayor Daley's machine in Cook County, Vice President-elect Johnson with Speaker Sam Rayburn in Texas. There was vote stealing everywhere. So Hoover suggested it was a good idea for both Nixon and Kennedy to sit down. So he rang President Eisenhower, who also agreed. So there was a meeting put together, and photographers and so on, but it was a private meeting. But in that meeting, Richard Nixon said to the new president, look, he said, you're going to have enormous pressures on you, enormous pressures as president. You have Camp David. You should use it. I will never criticise you if you say, I'm going away to Camp David for a few days to think about things. He said, you really need to do this. Obviously, we had the situation of Prime Minister Morrison in Hawaii that was in the back of my mind at the time. And I said, look, the Prime Minister says to the Leader of the Opposition quietly, I'm going to take some leave, Barnaby Joyce will be acting Prime Minister and so on, but I'll be on a telephone. Let's have a much more civil approach on these things. And that's not difficult to do.
No.
That is not difficult to do. So I thought that was a great example in November of 1960, in the middle of the Cold War, how people had just fought themselves to exhaustion in the election. It had been a matter of a few thousand votes here and there, but they're establishing a modus vivendi for the future.
Okay, well, I think it's time for Q&A. We're happy to take any questions. First question comes from Anthony. There's a microphone there, mate.
Anthony Carr, one of the key institutions in the three that you talked about is the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is the body which determines the rights in accordance with the rights section of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. To what extent is the controversy over the appointments to the High Court or the Supreme Court due to the fact that there is a Bill of Rights? And is the fact that the Bill of Rights enables the court to be, in effect, a legislative body on various issues, a problem in determining in its long-term credibility and its survival as a essentially neutral institution?
James, Louise?
I'll say something.
Do you want to go?
Would just quickly, before James says something which will be more erudite. I've thought long and hard about that. I'm really interested in the Constitutional Bill of Rights. I don't mind it. I think there are benefits to it. I'm not a conservative who completely rejects it. I like to think, and this is just my view, that the reason the Supreme Court is so politicised, it has more to do with the involvement of Congress or Senate in the appointment processes. I think that is where the politicisation starts. I mean, as one of the arms of government, the Supreme Court is there. It's a constitutional court. Our High Court is the same. It's a constitutional court. Constitutional courts are there to determine the legality of laws, but also the constitutionality of laws. So I think, a lot of conservatives think that courts shouldn't do that, and it's really only the Parliament should make the laws, and it's terrible that courts get involved at all. But I do think you need courts there to do that. Does the Bill of Rights take it too far? I think it's a cultural thing that has developed in America as a result of the Bill of Rights. But the good thing about the Bill of Rights is its educational value in terms of making children and citizens understand the values of democracy. And I think that's one of our problems in those of us in the Westminster system, that we don't value it because we don't learn about it. The reason we don't learn about it is because we don't have a Bill of Rights, or at least that's one of the reasons. And if we don't learn about it and don't understand it, we won't preserve it. So that's where I think America has it over us in some ways.
James Phillips.
I don't know much to add to that. I think the fact that one of the checks and balances is, as Louise has said, the capacity of the Senate, or the requirement that the Senate review candidates nominated by the President. So inherently it would be politicised. But of course, it's worth considering what would happen if that wasn't the case and the President's candidates could simply go through. Well, it would still be politicised, given the what should I say, the highly contested nature of politics in America. They wouldn't just be the best lawyers and candidates. There'd be a political element to their selection. So I think the answer to that is, it's inevitable in a large republic. The Supreme Court wasn't conceived as, I think, by the framers as quite having the importance that it later acquired.
Absolutely.
It wasn't even conceived initially necessarily as having a right to determine the scope of powers. That was determined a little later in a judicial decision. It was initially thought of mostly as being relevant to interstate disputes and such matters. But and I suppose a supplementary point is this: if there were a system where you would just choose the best judges, and if that's a concept that has no political component, which probably, well, it doesn't really, does it? I mean, inevitably, the best judges chosen in some more impartial way would have some cultural or political predisposition. So I think we just regard it as one of the three branches, which is inevitably to some degree politicised.
Next question, John.
Yes, James, it's a terrific book, and I have huge sympathy for it. I have some criticisms, but it's a marvellous book. And I have particular sympathy because when I was admitted to the Virginia Bar in the early 1960s, it became apparent that Virginia had been a separate colony almost as long then as it had been part of the United States. And within Virginia, and certainly that continuum was simply recognised. It was part of the bones of the place. So the idea that you've very eloquently propounded, that the origins of the US Constitution were to be found in earlier English legislation or charters or philosophies was completely accepted at that time. Having said that, I guess if the only criticism I might have of your book is that it underemphasises the rather grubby negotiations which gave rise to the Constitution, which were unsurprising because it was essentially a political document. It was dressed up, as was common at the time in many ways, in eloquent language. But essentially it was a series of political compromises. And the most striking of which, of course, was in relation to slavery, where, among other things, no representation was given to slaves. And yet, for political purposes of political representation, those states with slavery were given political representation of essentially one vote for every 3/5 of a slave. There were also provisions for return of slaves to fleeing slaves to their original states, etc. So, would you agree that some of the high-blown rhetoric that comes out that surrounds the Constitution, and certainly the exceptionalism, is somewhat overdone, given its, in many ways, predictably grubby politics behind it?
Sure. Short answer to that is sure, absolutely. And in American exceptionalism is no doubt partly had its genesis in the need to sell this new system and to try to bring some sort of cohesion to the nation behind the Constitution. But I don't disagree that I didn't go into huge detail on what happened in Philadelphia. I just have one chapter on it. I did actually deal with that particular issue, as you know, because what happened at Philadelphia was that issue went around for some time, around and around, and they ended up adopting a compromise that had been agreed during the Confederation period, the period between the Declaration of Independence and 1787, which was the 3/5 which is obviously just a sort of a sort of an outcome of a political process. There's no logic behind it. But yes, I certainly accept your general point that I didn't go into a great detail into how the compromises were formed.
Now's as good a time as any is to ask, James, did the Declaration of Independence have any impact on Australia decades later?
That's interesting because actually, whilst I was disappointed that we weren't able to assemble here because of the plague, but we made it tonight in spite of the flood, I did have an op-ed published in a US paper on that topic on the 4th of July, and what I said was this. The Declaration of Independence had three really important impacts for Australia. One, American independence resulted in a need for the British to send their convicts somewhere else. They looked at West Africa and other places, but they decided on the moonshot of Botany Bay. Two, when Australians came to want independence about a century after the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay, the British didn't resist because they'd learnt in America that might not go so well. And thirdly, insofar as the Declaration resulted in the Constitution, well, the American Constitution gives the Australian Constitution a lot of its structure. It's you can think of the Australian Constitution as not solely but substantially a synthesis of the British parliamentary system and the American constitutional model.
But surely, Stephen Loosley, there are big differences between our experiences. I mean, the Americans fought for their independence against the British, whereas the British fed us our independence in 1901, correct?
And they had strategic reasons for the Australian colonies federating too in terms of defence power. The great cultural difference between the United States and ourselves is quite simply this. The institutions to which the panel's been referring in American life are almost all soaked in blood. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution emerges from the Revolutionary War, from the Battle of Saratoga and Yorktown and 1,000 other skirmishes. It's actually the first civil war because there are a lot of Americans who identified with the British Crown. Now, the national anthem emerges from the War of 1812, from the siege of Baltimore. Francis Scott Key writes it while he's watching the British assault the city and the fortress. And the flag is confirmed in the trenches at Petersburg. It's shot full of holes, but it emerges. And the great remark that was made by Shelby Foote, the Civil War historian, about the year 1865 is simply this, that before Appomattox Courthouse, Lee's surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, the end of the war, people referred to America in these terms: the United States are. After Appomattox, it was always, and it is today, the United States is. So the American institutions are confirmed in battle. Australians talk the issues out, normally over a decade. If you look at the drafting of our Constitution, and correct me if I'm wrong, James, the first draft had a Bill of Rights, which had largely been taken from the American experience. You have the Statute of Westminster. It's adopted by the British Parliament in 1931. We don't embrace it until Dr. Evatt pushes it through in 1942. Again, a decade. The National Anthem. The Whitlam government changes it to advance Australia. Then Malcolm Fraser, one of his more enlightened decisions, changes it back to God Save the Queen. And it's the Hawke government that confirms Advance Australia Fair in 1984. Again, it's a decade. And so it goes. We tend to talk these issues out. We don't fight each other over them, and we don't inflict casualties upon our fellow citizens. I think that's the great cultural difference.
Good point. Yep. Next question. Yes.
Look, I'm the granddaughter of an American family that fled from England, so I became fascinated with Benjamin Franklin, and his house was directly opposite the Raindance School of Film where I was making docs. So we made a doc on Benjamin and his life. And he was the only American to be involved in the 5 significant documents that led to the establishment of the United States of America. And it's interesting, he also invented a music machine, glasses, a fire, fighting. Now, what I wanted to say about him was that he came from a history where he was cross-examined by the Privy Council over his role in objecting to taxation in Boston, that his house was threatened to be burnt down, and so on. So he was very vehement about finally making that break away. And I think we downplay the role of Benjamin Franklin, the only one to be involved in all 5 documents. I'd like to hear what you think of his role and the influence that he had on America with his background. And he was a marvellous inventor.
Oh, well, he really sort of, what should I say, he exemplified the American spirit in so many ways, right? I mean, in addition to his many other achievements, he was involved in establishing, as you know, in Philadelphia, many civic institutions and the like. And then, as you say, there's a polymath spanning all these activities. Unusually, of course, he was posted to Britain, because under its charter it had to keep a representative in Pennsylvania had to keep a representative in Britain, and he was that for about a decade, and subsequently minister to France and so on. By the time of the Philadelphia Convention and the drafting of the Constitution, he was very old and very ill. He had to be carried on a sedan chair to the convention. On a couple of occasions, he was not well enough to speak, and he gave his. He had someone else read a speech that he'd written, but he was clearly an immensely important influence at the convention as well, so in the drafting of the Constitution. And on a couple of occasions, we were talking about the process of reaching compromises, or we touched on that. His urgings to people to step back and to compromise, etc., seem to have been important in bringing about compromises. So someone of great both direct influence, but also a sort of almost symbolic importance as the sort of elder statesman who in many ways exemplified the independent American experience, the sort of character and aspirations.
Walter Isaacson, the prominent American author and historian, wrote a biography of Franklin a few years ago, and he made it very clear that Franklin was one of the few founding fathers who told Jefferson that the language in the Declaration of Independence was hypocritical because of the recognition or lack of recognition of the plight of slaves. So he was a very enlightened man. Michael Boehm, who's one of the few figures in our history who's been both a member of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it's great to see you always appearing still in the Spectator magazine. Michael.
I'm interested that you mentioned my member of the House of Representatives, because you can add to your 1976 centenaries. I first took double centenaries. I took my first seat for the first time in the House of Representatives in 1976, and the very tall person became Prime Minister. What I'd be keen to hear about is how, in the context of your determination that there was no threat of authoritarian takeover after the Trump defeat, is to what extent is there effective anti-authoritarian protection? I mean, I take your point about the diffusion of power. However, no nation that I know of, no democratic nation, pays so much attention to its love of country, its belief in the flag. Every child has etc. at school. There seems to be an extraordinary level of introspective nationalism, which seems to me to provide the opportunity for authoritarian involvement. I wondered if you are of the view that there is no scope in such a context for authoritarian rule in America.
Well, firstly, I think that your last comment is perhaps, with respect, a little dated, because now in a poll which you actually put to me, Tom, on another occasion, I think a poll of young people in America conducted about 2 years ago.
I'll just mention this was a Fox News poll last year, found an astonishing share of Americans under the age of 30, I think this was the poll, James. They think America's founders are better described as villains. This was 31%, rather than heroes, 39%.
Yeah.
James.
Yeah, so this is I spoke before about this sort of fracturing in fairly fundamental ways, I think, in American culture, and it extends very much to the views of America's past and present. So that pervasive nationalism, which is also actually probably relevant to the sort of civility that was previously seen, because there was seen to be some sort of overall mission. Now there's not so much a sense of an overall a shared mission. I think it is more fractured, and that view that was inculcated in and held by many Americans certainly for a number of decades after the Second World War has largely eroded. So would nationalism be the path for an authoritarian? I think probably not. I mean, it might work with some elements in some red states. It'd certainly be anathema in lots of blue states. But I hold the general view anyway that there's just too much diversity across any sort of dimension you choose to look at for it to be really likely that a demagogue could unite, a majority of the nation to seize power.
Next question, Ray.
Ray Hood, CIS member and Northside Radio broadcaster. There's been a recent move in British historiography towards more what Stephen was alluding to, that it was really more a civil war, not a revolution, as it didn't have the consequences, the bloody consequences of the French Revolution and, of course, the communist revolutions. And also that George III is getting a bad rap, that he was really quite a liberal king, and that a lot of the things said about him, especially in the Declaration, are not justified. I'd just like you to speak to that.
Yes, I think it's not inappropriate to characterise the American Revolution as the third English Revolution or British Revolution. It's a line that doesn't go down so well in America, but in some ways, of course, that's what it was. But since it had the special characteristic of the revolutionaries being located in a particular location, it's also not unreasonable to call it the American Revolution. As for George III, yeah, I mean, he made mistakes. He inherited a bit of a mess, right? Because the 7 Years' War was in some ways perhaps the first global war. It's very difficult to field and supply an army on the other side of the Atlantic in those days, the communications being what they were, and to maintain the navy, etc., and to engage the French across multiple locations and more than one type of military, both maritime and on land. So he inherits this massive debt. He doesn't know what to do with it. He thinks that the Americans should contribute to it. And he loses his way a bit in his early years. As he became more mature and confident in the role, perhaps he wouldn't have made those mistakes. He was perhaps unlucky with the inheriting that war at the beginning of his reign.
Stephen Loosley.
Very briefly, the American troops besieging Boston in the first weeks of the war still drank the health of George III every morning. It's only when the negotiations with the British government break down and it becomes very clear that independence is the only answer and the war is going to have to be fought, that views harden on the king. So that we have the result, and James alluded to this earlier, that the Constitution is designed for one overwhelming purpose only. There will never again be another King George. And that's the way they saw it. So the powers are diffused. But I always think it's fascinating Washington's troops drinking the health of the British King outside besieged Boston.
We'll wrap things up very soon, but before we do so, let me put this quote to Louise and then get a brief response from both Stephen and James. Given that James started proceedings by referring to the January 6 dramas in Washington, I thought we'd conclude with a provocative quote from a Robert Kagan, who's a distinguished neoconservative intellectual in Washington. He's with the Brookings Institute these days. And in the Washington Post just recently, he said, quote, "Donald Trump will be the Republican candidate for president in 2024. He enjoys mammoth leads in the polls. He's building a massive campaign war chest. And at this moment, the Democratic ticket looks vulnerable. Barring health problems, Trump is running." Kagan goes on to say, "Trump and his Republican allies are actively preparing to ensure his victory by whatever means necessary. Trump's charges of fraud in the 2020 election are now primarily aimed at establishing the predicate to challenge future election results that do not go his way. Republican legislatures across the nation are giving themselves greater control over the election certification process." Kagan's conclusion: "America is heading into its greatest political and constitutional crisis since the Civil War, with a risk of mass violence and the country divided into warring red and blue states." Louise Clegg.
Yes or no?
Look, I hate predicting the future and I'm not a betting person, but if I had to bet, I would say that's not going to happen. But there'll be a lot of people saying that. Look.
I mean, the checks and balances did work.
They did
last
work.
time,
Well, I recently had the privilege of teaching some undergraduate students a crash course in democracy. And at the beginning of the 5 lots of 2-hour lectures, so it was a crash course, and it was multi-faculty, undergraduates from all different disciplines. I asked them if they believed Trump was a threat to democracy. I thought that would be a good thing to start with. And of the 24 students in this sort of intensive course, 22 put their hand up and said yes. We then went through an exercise during the course, having looked at the history of democracy and the foundations of the Constitution. We looked at his policies and discussed whether they were legitimate, and everyone decided, well, yes, they were all quite legitimate. And then we looked at the way in which he was constrained during his presidency. And he was constrained very much by the courts, by the Congress, and by culture and political power. So I personally think that will happen again, and I hope it would happen again.
And Trump, for all his flaws, did tap into legitimate anxieties.
Absolutely.
Correct, James Phillips?
Yes.
Well, I thought that Trump was... This is how naive I was. I thought that Trump was partly a product of the sort of extreme progressive left in America, in the sense that quite a substantial part of the country had, that they were being sort of excluded from polite society and everything else. And the naive part was I hoped that it would cause a moment of self-reflection amongst the extreme progressives. And that, of course, didn't happen. But I see him, he is a pretty bizarre character, and I find it hard to imagine that in less polarised times he'd be a successful candidate.
And he will use the indictments by the Durham inquiry into those Democrats linked with the Clinton campaign who peddled this so-called Steele dossier to promote the idea that Donald Trump was a Putin puppet or a Russian agent. These indictments have been getting hardly any attention in the Australian media, but these indictments will be used by Trump to say that he was indeed subjected to a political witch hunt. This will fuel his comeback if indeed he does run. Stephen Loosley, it's not just Robert Kagan who's concerned about Trump being a threat to democracy. Paul Kelly, the distinguished Australian journalist who's been a guest here many times, he brought Kagan's column to our attention in The Australian recently. How worried should we be that a comeback Trump could be a real threat to American democracy?
I think we should be concerned, but the challenge has always been there. The lady here referred to Benjamin Franklin. As Franklin left Independence Hall after the constitutional drafting was completed, a woman stopped him in the street and said to him, "Mr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And his reply was extraordinarily instructive these days. "Madam, we have given you a republic if you can keep it." and that's always the challenge. Now, I always like Winston Churchill's observation that the future is unknowable, but we can draw some comfort from the past. So see how the United States reacts when there are challenges from the executive branch of the government, which are serious and really do destabilise the democratic process. One of my favourite presidents is Franklin Roosevelt, but he had a Supreme Court in 1936 that was gutting his legislation, and he's worried about the passage of Social Security. So he introduced the notion of a court packing plan. They were going to appoint 4 new justices. One of the first people who picked up on this running in Texas was Lyndon Baines Johnson. But the Congress, dominated by the Democratic Party, would not accept that. And what the Supreme Court then did was to change its attitude on FDR New Deal legislation, and the crisis passed. As the Nixon administration fell apart in 1974, the Defence Secretary, James Schlesinger, who was a canny operator, told the Joint Chiefs of Staff they were not to obey any order that issued from the White House. It had to come from him as the Defence Secretary. Constitutionally, that was invalid. But the Joint Chiefs had no problem with it because they realised the problem that was developing over in the White House. The same way that General Milley called his Chinese counterpart and said, "Look, there's not going to be any US attack upon you regardless of whatever is being said." So the system does respond well. The Republican Party is effectively now a cult of the Trump family. I mean, that's a brutal thing to say, but it's true. You know, Trump is dominating in the party itself. The result in Virginia may show a subtle shift in terms of a governor who's elected without Donald Trump there in the corner. So a lot hinges on who the Democratic nominee is going to be. I don't expect it'll be President Biden. I do not expect it'll be Vice President Harris. It'll be someone new. So that will change things. So I think so far as we can see ahead, there is a real concern there, Tom. But the system has responded effectively previously.
And the Wall Street Journal says that Kamala Harris, she's the Vice President, you just mentioned her approval rating is on a journey to the centre of the earth, with one poll lately pegging it at 28%, which is surely an historic low for a Vice President. Look, the book is called Two Revolutions in the Constitution, How the English and American Revolutions produced the Constitution of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our guests, James Phillips, Louise Clegg, and Stephen Loosley. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.